The rooster never crowed that morning. The storm had wrung the sound out of everything. Wind-battered cottonwoods stood like dark-soaked sentries, their leaves dripping in a steady hush that made Temperance Hale's breath sound too loud in her own ears. She stood barefoot on the gallery boards, cool plank against her heel, watching a ragged seam of pale sky work its way up from the eastern prairie. Somewhere close, a horse stamped and blew, the breath a white thread in the damp. Before she could decide whether the silence felt like mercy or warning, the dogs lifted their heads in the yard and stared toward the fence line. Not a bark, just that taut, intent listening that always meant something was moving where a person couldn't yet see. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. Thunder grumbled far off, slow and directionless, like a giant rolling over in sleep. Temperance, the few who knew her well called her Tem, tied her hair with the leather thong she kept looped around her wrist and stepped off the gallery. The mud yielded and sucked at the pads of her feet. She felt awake all the way down to bone. Where the horses grazed, dew was clinging to the wire, as if the storm had braided it there. She kept her eyes low, scanning the trampled grass for a sign of what had roused the dogs. What she found wasn't hoof sign or wolf sign. It was a seam of dark threads in the grass, brown inside brown, until the sky thought about brightening. Blood, thin with rain, strung in a patient line toward the mesquite break. Tem's mouth dried. The world, which had been broad as a sea a moment before, narrowed to the line of blood and the narrowing gap in the brush. There was a way the body remembered old cold, the particular draft of wind that had slipped under a tent wall the morning they buried her father on the Liano, the cool ripple of shade under a cottonwood where she'd lain so still a rattler slid past her cheek, the ache of water too long boiled, then gone tasteless in her throat. That cold went with her into the mesquite. She should have fetched the rifle first. She knew it. The thought came and went, and she went on. The dogs stayed at the edge of the yard, trembling, eyes like coins of winter sky. At the first cedar trunk, the blood was bright again where the rain had not reached. Someone had leaned there and slid down hard. She smelled iron, and under it cedar pitch and wet earth and the bitter, rooty tang of crushed yucca. He lay half-curled in the shadow of a fallen limb, one bare foot tucked into the cave of the other knee. For a moment, Tem thought he was a bundle of storm-torn cloth. Then the cloth breathed. He was older than a child and younger than a man, somewhere in that hard no country where a voice deepens and hunger is a permanent guest. His hair clung in wet strands against his forehead. The buckskin shirt was cut in a pattern Tem had seen at a distance on the southern plains, long fringe at the sleeves, quilled medallion chest piece dark with water. On the left side, just beneath the ribs, the buckskin had gone black with blood. He watched her first with the stillness of a deer that suspects it's been seen. When she knelt, he flinched, not back. His back had nowhere to go, but inward, as if to make less of a target of himself. The movement made him bite the inside of his cheek, and fresh blood brightened his mouth. "It's all right," she said, because it was what a person said, though nothing about this was all right. "You're hurt. I'm going to help." He blinked. His eyes weren't the amber brown of most folks she knew. They were dark, with a cool sheen, like wet obsidian. He lifted his right hand, palm open, and in it Tem saw not a knife, not a pistol, but a narrow strip of rawhide threaded through a little disc of hammered silver. A crescent of scalloped Spanish coin, Tem realized, cut and reworked and stamped with a design that looked like a sun, with 3 short rays. He touched the disc to his chest, very carefully, as if to remind himself it was still there. Then he held the hand out again. Open. Empty. "You'll freeze yourself to death in this," Tem muttered, mostly to anchor her own fear, and shrugged out of her shawl to tuck it around him. When she reached for his side, he tensed so hard his whole body seemed to turn to wood. "Let me see." She put the gentleness in her voice that she had once used with a wild-eyed mare and a feverish neighbor's boy who had not made it. He didn't give permission with words. He gave it with breath. The breath went out. He closed his eyes. Tem lifted the leather, and the wound looked back at her. A bullet had gone in clean and low, tearing skin and muscle, but, if grace could be measured, missing the bright roofs of the big vessels and the organs tucked behind them. The bleeding had slowed. The wound edges were pink and puffed with grit. It would be a hard thing to bring him inside. It would be an easy thing to let him bleed, to fetch the rifle, to fire it once in the air, and let the men from the river ranches come and take the decision away from her. The world had ways of telling a woman where the safe road lay. But there was a creature in Tem that had grown teeth the winter her father died, and the spring the grass did not come, and the fall a woman in town whispered words like they were bullets themselves. Indian thief, Indian lover, Indian widow, none of them true, all of them sharp. That creature raised its head now and looked at this boy who had pressed silver to his chest as if to keep his heart in, and made a vow Tem could feel even if she did not yet know its words. "I'm Tem. Temperance Hale." She touched her own chest in the same place he had touched his. "Tem."
He watched her mouth shape the syllable and tried it. Barely sound at all. Tim. Then he touched his own chest. What came out of him was 3 sounds, quick and bright like flint struck against steel. Ta-vie. She shaped it back to him, careful. Ta-vie. He closed his eyes once, a blink like yes. "Come on, Ta-vie." She slid her arms under his shoulders. He was all angles and heat and weight. The kind of weight that makes your legs feel their work from heel to hip. He clenched the shawl to keep it from snagging on the cedar. When she stood, the world went strangely quiet, as if the grass itself had stopped its whispering to listen for what she would do next. She did not take him through the front door. She did not want the floorboards to talk to anyone who might come asking later. She carried him around the kitchenelle and down the slope to the spring house, where the runoff from the storm sighed over limestone and into a low, dark basin. Inside it smelled of milk and stone and cold. She laid him on the shelf where she kept the buttercrocks and the last of the summer peaches put down in syrup. The shelf was cool enough to calm a fever and near enough to her kitchen that she could hear him breathe while she boiled water. When she cut the lace of the buckskin free of the wound, he watched her hands, not her face. Tim knew men who had fought in Mexico who would not have kept that kind of quiet. He hissed once when she poured boiled water, and once more when she threaded her needle with gut and set the first stitch. He gripped the rawhide disc so hard his knuckles whitened. When it was done, Tim put her hand flat, light as a leaf, on his sternum. "There," she said, and did not say the prayer that had risen wave-like in her throat. He slept like a broken bow, bent and bound. Tim went up to the kitchen and washed her hands in a basin of rainwater until they stopped trembling. She set a pot to boil. When the coffee smelled like smoke and hope, she took a cup to the doorway of the spring house and sat with her back to the jam. The dogs came and lay with their rib cages against her calves, warm and alive. Across the yard, the sky had opened and was laying thin lace of gold across the tops of the grasses. A kestrel flicked and steadied on a wire. If there was a choice to be measured, she had made it. Sometimes that was all there was to do. The first day, the storm stayed low and warm. Tim made a broth from a hen that had gone thin and onion tops that had sprouted again in the dark. She carried the bowl to Ta-vie and washed him through the spoon. People carried their fear in different places: neck, shoulders, wrists. The boy carried his in his eyes. It did not move when his body slept. It did not close when he closed them. She fed him as if feeding a wild thing, steady, not too close, careful not to crowd him. He took a sip, swallowed, took another. When he'd finished, he touched his fingers to his mouth, then to his chest. On another day, Tim would have laughed. Today, the small ceremony felt like a nice thing carved into the day where the day had nothing nice in it. The second time she went to the spring house, she found him awake and watching the door. He made a quick shape with his hands, fingers to palm, palm turned, something she couldn't read. Plain sign language was a vocabulary she only knew 5 or 6 words of: water, horse, trade, hungry, peace. Tim touched 2 fingers to her lips and extended them outward the way she'd seen a Kiowa man do once at the crossing. Thank you. Tavier watched and his fear flickered. Not gone, flickered. She cleaned the wound again and felt the heat along the edges. Not poison heat, she hoped, just the body doing what it does, ringing the alarm. When she set her hand to his forehead, he breathed deeper, like the dogs did when she set a palm on their flanks, and some of the grimness went out of his face. "Where's your wather?" she asked without thinking, and then wished for the words back. The boy's eyes shifted to the corner where the water ran out from under the shelf and disappeared under the limestone. He lifted the rawhide disc and looked at it as if it might give him an answer. He said something that had fewer edges than Spanish, softer and faster, syllables braided into something Tim's ear couldn't yet catch. He tapped his chest once, then extended a hand flat, palm up, the way a person does when they are offering and when they are begging not to have to. "All right," said Tim. She went to the kitchen and brought her father's old slate and a nub of chalk. She drew a little house and a little stick figure, silly as a schoolchild. "Tim," she said, and tapped her chest. "Tim." Then she drew a small figure with hair like a waterfall and another figure on a horse. She tapped the little hair waterfall and raised her eyebrows. Tavier watched her hand move. He took the chalk like a man takes a knife when you handed him hilt first. He made 3 quick strokes, precise and sure. He had drawn the same little sun with 3 rays stamped on the silver disc. Tim nodded towards the disc and family. She tried the Spanish she knew strangers on the trail sometimes shared, the only language besides English that sometimes made a bridge. Tu padre. He touched the disc, then touched a place in the air above his head, then touched the ceiling itself as if to say, higher. Then he wiped the chalk sun and drew a horse with such life in 3 movements that Tim felt sudden grief. Grief for the fact that someone had made a child draw so fast, so small, so much. Under the horse, he drew a long line, and on the end of the line, a spear. For the first time, a light moved behind the fear in his eyes. He said a word quiet, reverent, not a child saying his father's name, but a singer speaking the name of a river. Tim could not shape the sounds, but she could shape the meaning. Father, warrior, chief maybe, though she did not think the word in her head because the word smelt like newspapers written by men who had never sat across from an injured boy and let him hold a spoon with 2 hands. "Does he know where you are?" Tim asked. Tavier's gaze went to the door. He nodded once, the motion so small she would have missed it if she had blinked. Then he held his right hand out, palm flat, and tilted it like a man feeling wind on a bluff. He shifted it a finger's width. He did it again. 3, Tim tried, holding up 3 fingers. He touched my middle finger. 2, he touched my ring finger. 4, his brow furrowed. She smiled despite herself and lifted 3 fingers again, and then touched the dawn light in the doorway with them, 1 tap each, and on the 3rd tap the boy's mouth softened around a word that Tim thought might be yes. He lifted the silver disc, let it rest on his sternum, and breathed toward it. "Tavachi," he said very quietly, and then again, louder, as if to teach the room. He tapped the disc. "Tavachi." Tam nodded. She had no idea if Tavachi meant the son or the father or the vow or all of them braided into one thing too big for English to hold, but she nodded like a woman who believed what she had been shown. On the road that bent past Tem's place like a river braid, the hooves of a dozen men had left shallow moons in the mud. Around noon, the men themselves came. Tem heard them first in the old cottonwoods, the way birds fly up in a body and then settle right back down, as if deciding the thing riding toward them isn't a coyote or a cougar, but something human and therefore manageable if risked. She wiped the counter twice with the same stroke she'd used since she was 15 and learned the comfort of work that leaves a shine, and then she stepped onto the gallery with her apron twisted in her hands. Ephraim Crowley rode in the lead, not because he was the best with a rifle, he drank too much to be steady, and not because he was the best with a map, he could get turned upside down in his own cornfield, but because Crowley was the kind of man who wanted to be first in line when anyone was measuring worth. He tipped his hat. His mustache had been black last year. It was a little gray at the corners now, the color of old cotton. "Miss Hale?" he said, and aimed the smile at her that he used on church widows and river ferrymen. "Storm treat you decent?" Roof held. Horses in the next valley weren't so lucky. Fence down. Signs of stock driven. He let the words trail off like smoke, as if he were reluctant to say what he had ridden here specifically to say. "Posse's going to follow the trail. Riders dawn to dusk until we catch 'em. You'll want to shut her up early." Tem dried her hands on her apron, a motion to keep them from curling into fists. "Catch who?" Crowley lifted his chin toward the south, where the prairie lay flat and unadorned as a long-held breath. "Numanu," he said, making the Comanche word something harsh because it didn't fit in his mouth. "They come up after the storm and slipped off with horseflesh and a boy from the Norris's place." He squinted at Tem as if gauging whether the sentence had landed the way he intended. "They left blood." Tem felt a cool place open at the base of her skull. She put her hand against the door jamb because it was steady. "You think they're near?" "Tracks say so." He leaned and spat neatly into the dust. "We'll need water on the trail. You've always been generous about your spring." "It's not my spring," Tem said before she could stop herself. "It was here before me and will be here after me." Crowley's smile stayed. His eyes hardened, two little stones under shallow water. "And yet your say-so's what lets an ant draw a bucket without debt. That makes it yours enough for a thank you." He tipped his hat as if the thanks were already given and received. "If you see anything—" "I'll send the dogs," Tem said, and was surprised to find she'd meant the words to be a joke. It came out as it came, faithful and thin. Crowley's gaze slid past her into the dim of the house. She had left the kitchen door ajar, and the cool breath of the spring house drifted up the hallway. Tem felt it against the back of her knees and knew it could be a kind of betrayal, the way a stiff breeze can be a flag whether you mean it to or not. "Someone sick?" he said, as casually as a man asking after the price of eggs. "Smells like lye and steam in there." Tem kept her face like the pantry door, shut, latched, the hasp rusty and stubborn. "I boiled linens this morning. The storm damp gets into everything." He let the stare linger a second longer than made sense if he believed her. Then he turned his head and squinted toward the river. "We'll be riding long and hard," he said, as if the other words had not happened at all. "If they double back, these places close to the Lashley Ford will catch the worst of it." He looked past her again, not at the house this time, but at the sky, the way a man in a church sometimes stares past the preacher at the rafters when he wants God to see him looking. "You got that little cross still over your bed?" Tem did not look back at the shadows in the hallway. She kept her eyes on Crowley. "My father carved it. It stays where it is." Crowley nodded once, as if a man had given him a piece of information he could use later, and gathered his reins. "You're alone out here," he said, not out of concern.
Alone makes a person soft in the head. You hear me?" Tem smiled and let him feel how sharp a soft thing could be if you held it right. "I hear the wind, Mr. Crowley. When it talks, I listen." He snorted. "That's so. Winds talk out here, do they?" He put heels to his horse and rode on without waiting for an answer. The men behind him pretended they had not been listening at all. As the dust from their passing settled in the yard, Tem leaned her head against the door and let her breath out tight between her teeth. In the spring house, the boy breathed. The water ran its small, relentless music. The world had placed a delicate, breakable thing in the palm of her hand and then asked her if she trusted it not to fall. By afternoon, the sun had come out clean. The mesquite lit itself like 1,000 candles. Tem worked because it steadied her, hauled water, swept mud off the gallery, coiled a length of rawhide she'd left out to dry, and cursed herself for the waste. The dogs slept, sides rising and falling like bellows. In the spring house, Teyave watched the thread of sunlight move along the stone wall the way a hawk watches a mouse path. When Tem brought him water, he raised himself on one elbow without grimacing. When she lifted the cup, he reached and steadied her wrist with 2 fingers, not because she spilled, but because touch had become a language they both could read. "Hungry?" Tem asked. He made a small motion with his mouth that was not quite a yes and not quite a no. She brought him a heel of coarse bread, softened in broth. He took it between finger and thumb, like a man taking a sacrament. The silver disk lay against his chest. Once, in the full place of silence that sometimes opens between 2 people, even when they barely share words, Tem reached toward it and paused, asking permission without asking. Teyave lifted the disk by its thong and set it in her palm. It was heavier than it looked. The stamp was weathered with use and oil smooth with touch. Tem rubbed her thumb along the edge where the Spanish date had been cut away. She felt something like a burr there, a nick where a tool had slipped. She wondered whether a father's hand had made that nick, cursing himself softly and laughing when his son had said it made the sun look like it had a tooth. Teyave watched her read the metal and nodded once when she looked up. His eyes had gone somewhere distant, not far, not to another room, but to a high ridge and the wind on a horse's neck and a man's laugh that a boy carries like a full canteen. He said the word again, the one she kept hearing as Tevachi. He tapped the disk, he tapped the air between them. He tapped his own chest hard enough to leave a red print. "All right," Tem said. "All right." She gave the disk back with 2 hands and bowed her head without thinking. Teyave lifted it to touch her knuckles before settling it to her sternum again. The gesture was so old it felt like it belonged to the earth rather than any people. That night, the moon rose like a cut fruit over the prairie, the wet air making it look closer than it had a right to be. Tem lay on her pallet and did not sleep for a long time. When sleep came, it set a small, insistent dream in her head. A horse, standing hip-shot in a sea of bunch grass, a man with a lance resting across his thighs like a rower's pole, and a road as thin and straight as an oath. In the morning, when she carried water to the spring house, Teyave was awake as if he had been waiting for her. He raised 3 fingers. Then he folded one down. 2, Tem said, and felt the day stand up inside her. The second day was sunlight end to end. If trouble was on the land, it was courteous enough to hide behind a perfect sky. Tem spread white sheets on the grass and beat them with a willow switch until the dust came out of them in gray life, like a thing that had had a shape and lost it. She boiled the needle again and packed the wound with clean cloth. She gave Teyave willow tea for the pain and watched the tension leave the patch of skin between his eyebrows like wind leaving canvas. She took the rifle down and cleaned it. She lit a candle in the kitchen and set a tin cup over it and watched the wax tears crawl down the sides until a white-shirted man on a sorrel horse appeared on the road as if conjured. Tem's breath hitched in her throat and then went on. The man was not Crawley.
It was the circuit preacher, Elijah Dodd, who sweat through his collar in winter and in summer preached like his body would not forgive him for saving his soul. He tied his horse at the post and climbed the gallery steps as if he'd been climbing galleries since the day he could walk. "Miss Hale," he said, fanning his hat at the doorway, "you got a minute for a sinner?" Tem stepped aside. "I've got as many minutes as anyone else." "Fair enough," he said, and came in. He looked past her toward the kitchen where the hallway went dark. "That spring of yours, God made, but you keep it tidy. It cools a man to know such orders in the world." Tem did not smile. "Coffee?" He took it like communion. Elijah God could pray, and he could drink coffee. That was almost enough for Tem to trust him. Almost. "Hunger in the river?" she asked, as if the question were merely polite. "The Norris's boy is alive, scared and scraped but alive. A rider found him on the north side of the bottoms before first light. Likely he slipped and cut himself in the storm and spooked himself into thinking he had been taken. Stories are like that. They take a shape and go running before a person's had time to look them in the face."
Tim's throat loosened. She had not realized how tight it had been until the preacher's words unstuck it. "And the horses?" "Gone," he said. "That's true enough. Men do love their horses. Men will forgive their brother for sins that would make the Lord blush, but will not forgive a stranger a single sorrow." He leaned his head back and looked at her ceiling, as if God might have carved a message there. "You seem like a woman who knows the weight of a day before you pick it up." Tim lifted her chin. "We all carry what we're given." "And some carry more," he said. His gaze drifted again toward the hallway. She wanted to wrench it back with both hands and tell it where to look. "If a person found a soul hurt on their land," he said slowly, "if that soul belonged to someone other folks fear, if that person chose to bind rather than cast out, well," he smiled, small and real this time, "that would be a story I'd like to tell God when I have to explain what I did with the days he gave me." Tem's eyes were hot suddenly. She set the coffee pot down too hard and sloshed it on the stove. "Elijah," she said, quietly, because she had never been able to call him preacher when they were alone, "if a person found such a soul and bound it, would you tell the other riders?" "I'd tell the person to keep a white cloth at hand, because not every rider knows how to ride with his hands open." He stood. "You keep that rifle oiled, Miss Hale, and keep mercy sharper." When he was gone, Tem leaned against the wall and let herself slide a little down it, the way a person slides down a tree after they have seen lightning hit the far ridge and not this one. In the spring house, Tavia's breath steadied. In his fingers, the silver disk winked once, like daytime starlight. That evening, the sky burned itself to cinders and then went the color of old tin. Tem sat on the gallery with the dogs and sewed a line of neat stitches along a tear in the hem of her dress that had been there long enough to feel like a scar. Somewhere out on the prairie, a herd of horses moved the way a living river moves, slow where it could, fast when it must. Tim could feel them through the soles of her feet like thunder come up through rock. She went to the spring house and found Tavia sitting up. He had pushed himself until his back touched the cold stone and his breath had learned again how to use the bottom of his ribs. He looked tired and stubborn and closer to beautiful than Tem would have believed a person half-starved and stitched could be. "Tomorrow," he said. The word was his. The accent changed the slope of it. He made it sound like a path. He lifted 3 fingers and then touched his heart with the same hand. "Tevachi." Tem did not know whether Tevachi meant a man or dawn or both. She nodded, because there are truths a body doesn't have to name to feel. She gathered the white cloths from the grass and folded them over her arm. When she tucked one between her belt and her dress so that it hung like a flag at her hip, Tavia's eyes went to it and stayed. He lifted his right hand and drew a line from the cloth to the doorway, to her face and back, the shape of a promise. "Parley," Tem said, tasting the word. "Truce. I know a few words." He nodded once. He lay back down. This time when his eyes closed, sleep took him the way a strong swimmer takes a current. Deliberate, hopeful, not entirely at mercy. The third dawn came quiet. The rooster remembered his job and sang. Fog lay low as the breath of cattle in winter. Tem dressed in the best thing she owned that could still take dirt and blood, a dark skirt, a linen shirt. She braided her hair tight against her skull and tied the braid with a strip of buckskin cut from an old pair of gloves. She tucked the white cloth at her hip. She put the rifle where she could reach it without reaching like a threat. She fed Tevye broth and saw that the fever had let go of the edges of him and retreated to some small camp where it could be watched. He sat up and ate with both hands. When he had finished, he set the cup on the stone and said a word that sounded like a piece of river polished to speak. He touched 2 fingers to his lips and extended them toward her. It was the thing she had done to him. It was his now. He gave it back. "If your father comes," Tem said, keeping her voice even by asking her heart to beat no faster than a hammer on a wall hook, "I will stand with this." She touched the white cloth. "I will ask to speak." She tapped her lips. "And listen." She tapped her ear. "Listen." He took her hand, the way a child sometimes takes a stranger's hand when they've recognized the shape of safety and don't yet know its name. He pressed the silver disc between her palm and his for a heartbeat and let it go. Then he lay back down and closed his eyes. Tem stood and did not move for a long count of 10. Then she moved because staying still had never saved a person from anything but a rattlesnake. The dogs went stiff first. They lifted their heads and drew the scent of morning into their noses, as if they could read the day in it like a letter. Tem put her hand to the gallery post. She felt it there, not through the wood, but through the ground itself. A tremor, fine as thread, regular as breath. Horses. Tem stood with her back to the jamb and let the spring house smell like milk in stone and blessing. It felt indecent to be there and indecent to leave. The man leveled his breath with effort and then raised his head. He looked at the stitchwork, the boiled cloth, the clean poultice that had drawn the heat from the wound's edges, the cup rinsed and set upside down to dry. He saw the way Tem's hands had shook, so she'd steadied them by setting 2 butter crocks in line like soldiers. He saw all of it in the way a person who lives close to the land sees all of a thing without having to be taught how. He stood. He turned toward Tem and laid his palm flat against his chest again. He said the word. This time, Tem knew what it meant because of how the room felt when he said it. Tevachi, he said. Not the boy's name, the vow between them. Then he said more. Spanish and some English, sliding between them with the ease of a man who has moved goods and promises across languages his whole life. You took him in, you bound him, you fed him with your own hand. You are brave. He did not pick the word to flatter. He picked it like a man picks a tool from a belt, because it is the one that fits the thing he is doing. Tem did not flinch from the word. She had been called worse words and better ones. I did what I would want done for me, she said. And then, because the truth loves a clean count, and what I would want done for any child. He nodded once, short. He stepped back toward the door. Outside, a bird trilled, funny and bright, as if it had forgotten what morning it was. He ducked from the spring house and stood in the thin sun with his face turned toward the yard. The riders had not moved. They had become a different kind of stillness, the kind a person learns when they have sent breath ahead into a room they cannot enter and are waiting to hear what it has to say when it returns. The man lifted his chin toward the white cloth at Tem's belt. Parley, he said. His English like a stone a river had carried a long way and made smooth. We speak. He gestured toward the open yard, and Tem understood that he meant here, not in the small space where milk and doctoring and mercy had made a separate kind of air. Here, where the sky could see, and therefore all their people could see through it. They stood by the gate with the dew lifting itself into light around their boots. The lance lay across the man's forearms now like a thing that had been put down in the mind, if not in the hands. Tem felt the dogs lean their weight against her calves and wondered whether a person could draw courage up through their skin from a dog the way a man draws water from limestone. "The boy," the man said, nodding toward the spring house as if a whole world could be indicated with a tilt, "will live?" Tem made herself answer as if he had asked about the weather, because if a person let the shape of the wanted thing get between them and the truth would go wrong. "Yes," she said, "if the wound stays clean, if fever stays small, if he does not run too soon." She paused. "He should not ride far for 5 days. 10 would be wiser. But I am not the kind of stubborn that keeps a man from his son with rules." The man's mouth did an odd thing. It twitched, not like a smile, and not like something that hurt. Then he said a string of syllables, slow and deliberate, and then again slowly in Spanish. "Soy—" He stopped, as if the name, like the vow, needed to be given to the air carefully. "Soy Paku Tsatu." He waited. "I am—" He searched for the English like a man searches a saddlebag with his fingers for a thing he knows is in there. "I am Lancer of the—" He stopped. He tapped his own shoulder where the beadwork band was. "Koitsentu." Not a boast. A cub's teeth shone only briefly, and then covered again. Tem nodded because whatever he had named himself, it had settled into the ground like a stake. She did not say she had heard that word in town once from a man who did not deserve to speak it. She did not say she had watched his careful respect and known without the word what he was. She said, "My father was a saddler." And it was, somehow, exactly the right answer. He breathed, and his breath came all the way into his chest and filled it this time. When a person binds a wound, they take the blood of the other onto their own hands. We know this. He lifted his right hand and looked at it as if checking for blood that had not dried there, but might as well have. He said there is a count, debts, gifts. He lifted his chin toward the riders. "They watch me count." Tem felt the ground tilt and right itself. "I didn't do it to be counted." He looked at her, long and grave. "I did not ask you to, and so the count is heavier." He put his left hand, scar and all, flat to his chest. "I will put it on my own back. If men come, I will stand in their sound. If they throw flame, I will carry it out in my hands." He glanced toward the river road as if he could feel the echo of hoofbeats there. The ones who turn their faces away from sun and make their eyes like stones. "Crowley," Tem said softly, and hated herself for letting the name slip into air. The man's gaze sharpened in a way that reminded her of a hawk dropping a foot toward a snake. "He has eaten too much salt from others' hands," he said. "Men like that grow thirsty in the wrong place." Tem swallowed. The white cloth was suddenly heavy. She adjusted it, not a gesture of fear, but of readiness. "We can speak," she said, because it was the only gift she had to give besides a cup and a needle and her 2 hands set to work. "They will," he said. He tipped his chin toward the east. The sun had lifted itself a finger's width. "Men cannot forgive a thing they themselves fear they would not have done. You took in a boy whose breath scared them." Tem looked at the springhouse door and imagined walking through it alone at dawn to find nothing but a warm hollow where a boy had been. "He would have died," she said. Then, because truth loves clean counts, she added, "he may yet." The man nodded once. The motion was not acceptance, it was acknowledgement of the shape of the world. "You will stand," he said. "I see this." He looked past her shoulder, over the roofline where the cottonwoods stood with their leaves making secrets. His eyelids lowered as if he were listening with them. "They come." The first hoofbeat rolled across the flats like a coin spun on a countertop and flicked into a corner. Then another. The riders by the springhouse did not move. The main body of the Comanche file turned as one, the horses' ears hooking toward the sound, and then stilled again, as if the bodies on their backs had told them with the pressure of knees, "Not yet." Tem felt the instant her own heart wanted to reach for the rifle. She did not. She reached for the white cloth and lifted it high in one hand. The cloth caught a slant of sun and became bright, ridiculous as wedding linen in a slaughterhouse. She stepped forward into the open, between her house and the road, and stood with her feet flat and her weight settled and the cloth steady. From the cottonwoods at the bend, a loose handful of men rode out, Crowley among them, as if they had been waiting there for just the right arrangement of light. They had counted there in the leaves and chosen to arrive at the exact moment when their number might look larger against the thin fog. Crowley checked when he saw the riders in Tem's yard, checked again when he saw their number, and then made that little adjustment only a man who wants to believe his own importance makes. He lifted his chin and rode on as if it were him who had arranged them there with his own hands. "Miss Hale," he called, "you mind stepping back from those savages? You don't know what—" Tem raised the white cloth higher. The gesture made the next words out of his mouth catch and splinter. He stared at the cloth, then at Tem's face, and then at the man standing 10 paces behind her with a lance held very politely across his forearms. "Parley," Tem said, loudly enough for her voice to carry and matter. She made her mouth careful with the word. "Parley, Mr. Crowley." Crowley laughed. It had the sound of a fence wire too tight, plucked and buzzing. "Parley? With them? Girl, they don't know the meaning of—" "My house," Tem said quietly. "My yard. My word." He pulled his horse up dumb, more startled by the steel in her voice than by the 50 warriors watching him consider whether he was in fact the history he told himself at night. For a long breath, he seemed to weigh something he had never before had to weigh, the cost of proceeding as if the world would make way for him. "You want parley?" he said, finally, making the word ugly. "What's to be talked?" He turned a little in his saddle, showing the riders behind him that his shoulder blades were as brave as his chest. "They've got horse flesh from our side of the river, and they've got a boy in there who—" "Who is a boy?" and felt something hot climb her throat. She swallowed it down into a place that could hold it for later. "He bled on my land. I bound him. Your own preacher would tell you the rule." She saw Elijah Dodd at the back of the riders then, hat low, gaze steady, and saw the small motion he made with his hand, a blessing like a man passing bread. Crowley saw the motion too. He swung his horse's head and glared at the preacher as if a dog he thought he owned had bared its teeth. He turned back to Tem and to the man behind her. "What's your name?" he demanded, in a tone a man uses with a drifter he plans to beat whether the answer comes or not. The man touched his chest with his left hand. He said the syllables again, not slow now, not like a lesson, but like a bell rung, true and loud. He did not reach for the English. He did not reach for the Spanish. He spoke himself and let the air learn him. Crowley sneered. "Not in this language," he said, and to the men behind him, "He says he's a chief, which makes him the one to hang first when this goes wrong." Tem felt the cloth hot in her hand, though the morning was cool. She saw the riders behind Crowley shift, not toward guns exactly, but toward the place in a man where a gun will fit if it has to. She breathed in and out, and let her breath make her heavier, as if she could add weight to the ground with it. "We talk," she said again. "Two things." She held up 2 fingers, because sometimes a man who has made his hearing small will still watch a hand. 1. The boy lives because men of his people sat their horses and waited while I stitched him, instead of storming my door. 2. He is not yours to take. He does not belong in your stories. She angled her body a fraction so Crowley could see the springhouse door without losing sight of her. She did not look away from him. "If you step 1 foot on that slope, Mr. Crowley, I will call it a trespass, and every man who loves me will know I called it that." He barked a laugh.
Every man who loves you. Who's that, Miss Temperance? That old coon preacher? Those dogs?" His eyes cut to the men behind Tem's visitor, to the beadwork and the braided hair and the quiet, deliberate hands. "You think they love you?" The word left the man's mouth like a hand opening, and the whole yard answered it. The horses behind him flowed, the only word Tem's mind could find for it, out and around as if the morning itself had loosened. Lances that had rested like questions lifted and angled not toward bodies, but toward the lines of sight where rifles would rise. Rawhide shields came forward and turned sideways to make slabs of moving wall. A pair of riders cast buffalo hide drags in one rough, practiced motion and kicked into them. Dust rose in a round curtain that made the yard seem briefly bigger than it was, and filled the places where a man's eyes want to find a target with light and grit instead. Tem's palms stung where the torn white had burned her, but she did not look at it. She moved. Tevier was a shape in the springhouse doorway, the silver disk a little moon against his chest, both hands braced so hard on the jamb that his fingertips had left 3 red commas in the paint. She crossed the yard in 3 strides that felt longer than a life, put both hands under his arms, and pivoted him back inside as something struck the lintel and sang like a bell rolled thin. The dogs slid in with them, haunches low, bodies between Tem and the open world. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. The spring house swallowed sound the way it swallowed cold, all at once, and then in smaller and smaller gulps. Tem eased Tevier down onto the stone shelf. He sucked air like a fish brought to the bank and said one word sharp as chipped flint. Not a complaint, a warning, hers, not his. He lifted the silver disc and held it, palm up, offering not to keep, but to touch like a priest holds bread before breaking it. "I'm here," Tem said, though the boy hadn't asked. She touched the disc with 2 fingers, and the ground under her boots steadied. Not because the yard had grown safer, but because she had remembered the count she herself had chosen to keep. Outside, the yard broke into pieces and then made itself into a different shape. Tem saw it because she was watching for it. The way the men behind Crowley checked at the first dust, and then, because they had ridden behind Crowley too long not to know how the story went, threw their shoulders forward into the check to make it look like a charge. Crowley lifted his rifle again, his mouth moved. Tem didn't need the words to know what was in them. The Coitsenko Lancer, the boy's father, did not look at Crowley. He looked at the men behind him. His left hand twitched. 2 riders nearest the well lifted lariats they had coiled flat in their fists until now, and flicked them with their wrists. The loops flew low and true. One caught the barrel of Crowley's rifle and jerked it sideways, so the net shot tore a clean hole through Tem's wash line instead of anything human. The other looped a second man's rifle at the wrist, and by the time he realized his gun had been lead, he was looking into the hairy round of a rawhide shield and a horse's shoulder. "Back!" Elijah Dodd's voice carried, calm and huge from the cottonwoods. "Back! Hold your fire!" For a breath, it looked like breath might be enough. Then one of the lower Ford men, Tem didn't know his name, his hat sat on his head like he had borrowed another man's head and guessed at the size, jerked his pistol and fired into the dust because he wanted the sound. Sound made him feel like a thing in a story, not a man whose hand was shaking. The shot hit stone. The spring house kicked small chips into Tem's hair. Tevier's breath hitched once, and then leveled again, because she had put her hand on his sternum the way she'd done on the first day, and kept it there long enough to tell his body what she wanted it to do. "Stay," Tem told the dogs, and they did.
They held to the stone like they had grown from it. She took the clean cloth from the peg and folded it 3 times and pressed it to the place where Tevye's stitches had tugged loose. He did not cry out. He made the noise a hawk makes when a gust shoves it sideways and it has to remember how to be a wing instead of a leaf. "Tem," Elijah's voice again nearer now. "Tem, speak if you can." "Parley holds," Tem shouted, and heard the shape of it in her own mouth. Not a plea, not even an argument, but a bell rung to remind a town what time it is. "Parley holds." She felt the room itself listening. The spring house had been built by a man with hands like her father's, careful, square, trusting stone to do what stone does if a person stacks it right. It had kept milk cold and children safe from July heat. Now it held a word steady in its walls, long enough for a yard full of men to hear it and decide whether they would be the kind of men who let a word do its work. Outside, the dust thinned in a seam. Through it, Tem saw Crowley's face, narrow with the kind of fury that has done so much work that it has forgotten what it's for. He snatched the rope off his rifle with a jerk that skinned his knuckles, and he smiled, the way a man smiles when he believes he has found the shortest way back to the story he wanted to be living. "Take the boy," he said, and did not aim the words at Elijah or at the lancer, but at the place in the air where men who like to be told what to do keep their ears.
The bay's hooves eat the street in clean 4-beat sets. Elijah's gelding just off Tem's knee, 3 riders behind like the steadying hand of a friend on a shoulder you didn't know was bowing. The night carried a new sound, low and wrong. Water burning. The river bent toward her place like a great dark rope, and along its edge ran a sheet of fire, the oil catching in islands, leaping the seams where roots rose and made it shallow, racing ahead of itself in ribbons. Tem felt the cold reach of fear and put it in a pocket where it could ride without steering. She leaned into the bay's neck, her burned palm stinging against the rein, and the mare flattened, tail tight. A creature who loved a straight line when there was work at the end of it. They left town behind in the span of a prayer and a single argued breath. The road dipped and rose and showed them her house. Below roof, black against a dull sky. The spring house a square of lighter dark. The gallery rails a thin skeleton. Between the cottonwoods at the bend and the spring house, the river slid like a chest drawing breath. Fire licked its surface. The ring of riders had already moved. In the scant moonlight, Tem saw them as brief, fluent shapes. 2 men cutting brush with their knives and heaping it into a line that would drink oil and slow flame. 3 more dragging wet hides from saddles and slinging them across the slick surface. Starfish shadows settling and smothering. A boy, no older than Tevye, carrying a bucket in each hand, balanced and fast. The lancer stood in the yard with his lance low and his left hand cutting small circles in the air that were somehow larger than his arm had a right to make. Men answered those circles with motion and with stillness on cue. "Buckets to the spring!" Elijah shouted, and men who had ridden out to be spectators found their feet in the harness of work. They slid down and ran. Tem hit the ground running too, and the bay, trusting her, stopped where she left her and dropped her head to breathe. The first breath of hot oil blew across the yard, thick, syrupy, wrong. Tem's jaw clenched. She tied her hair off her neck with her teeth and the strip of leather she kept looped on her wrist. She grabbed 2 buckets and ran downhill to the spring, where the water came up clean even under a sky like this. "Phil, pass, don't look," she told 2 men who got to the water the same heartbeat she did. "Don't read the fire, read the hands." She set her feet wide, dipped, lifted, found the weight, turn, and the buckets left her in 2 new hands without spilling. She dipped again. The line formed because lines love to form when an object with a handle appears and people remember how to be one body. The first tongues of flame found the yard in 3 places at once. The low grass along the far fence where oil had lapped over and caught on dry seed heads. The stacked wood at the corner of the kitchen where Tem had been stingy with the tarp last rain. A stray rag of oil on the river itself catching at the foot of the springhouse steps as if invited. Tem cursed and did not apologize. She looked left and saw the lancer look the same direction in the same breath. She threw the first bucket at the stair, and he sent a rider with a wet hide to the stacked wood and another to the fence run. "Cut there!" Elijah's voice made a clean line through dust and fear. He had a shovel in his hands already and put it into the earth where the grass ran thickest, carving a trench, the blade ringing against rock the way a bell rings to pull a town's attention into one note. Men followed the sound. The line of sand and clay and limestone widened. The first lick of grass fire ran up to it and thought hard about the jump and lay down instead. Two men beat at a straight tongue with green willow boughs. The leaves smoked and did what leaves do when asked to step into a hot argument. They cooled the air a fraction. Sometimes a fraction is enough.
Tem set a bucket aside and grabbed the wool blanket she had left folded at the spring house door. The blanket hit the oil-starved tongue on the stair and smothered it with a disgruntled hiss. She put the heel of her hand on the blanketed flame and pressed. Pain climbed her arm like a fast animal. She kept pressing until the hiss let go. Then she lifted the blanket and let it flop open to find air, and found none there that wanted fire more than her. "Back!" someone shouted. No fear, just the word, the way a shepherd throws a stone near a ewe's nose to turn her without striking. A beam loosened in the night's earlier foolishness when bullets had chewed the gallery post, gave up its argument with gravity, and slid. A rider stepped into the fall without thinking and put his shoulder under it. He took the weight, and then the weight took him, and then, blessedly, two more backs came into the space under the beam, and the three of them lowered it like a long, sleeping man into a spot where it wouldn't be anyone's last thought. Tem ran to the far corner where fire had sniffed a heap of oak kindling. From the road, men came with canvas sacks slung over their shoulders, dipping them in the spring, heaving them in arcs, water falling heavy. The hill below the spring house ran with runoff, little rappels of clean over rock. The oil wanted to ride the runoff up toward the door. Tem threw dirt with her hands at the runnel and watched it turn past, thwarted. Oil is lazy when the ground asks it to climb. She felt Tavier before she saw him. The way the entire spring house changed its breath when a body inside it shifts with pain is a thing a person knows if they have spent 2 nights listening. He had woken. He was trying to sit up. Tem shouted to the air without taking her eyes off the flame. "Stay!" The word cut small and fierce. She heard the soft sound his hand made when it found the silver disc and the shelf, and chose not to be bigger than a body can be one day after being sown. The river fires swept on, thinner now, islands and commas of flame moving, still wrong but less boastful. The ring of riders thinned and thickened with it, like a breathing wall. Tem saw the lancer in 3 places in 3 breaths, which was impossible and also true. At the fence, sending 2 horses dragging a green mesquite trunk across a strip of grass ahead of the fire. At the spring house, where he set his empty hand against the door jamb once, like a benediction he was too proud to speak. At the wagon that had carried kerosene to the river and now sat ridiculous in her yard, useless as a sermon preached at a flood. "Tip it," Tem said, and 3 men answered before they knew who they were answering. They didn't ask which way. Elijah's hand showed them. He set his shoulder to the barrel and pushed. The thing tipped with a long, belching sigh and spilled the last of what it had meant to use against them into the dirt, where the dirt took it without thanks. Then, of course, because a night like this is all miracle and no patience, something went wrong on the left. A cottonwood limb, hollow with age, caught along its inner curve. Fire ran inside it like it had been built to be a fuse. It cracked and fell into the path the riders were using to bring wet hides from the spring. A young man, one of Crawley's, Tem realized with the double vision nights like this afford. A man who had come not to help but to watch and was seized by his better self and put into the line anyway, stumbled. The burning limb pinned his boot to the ground. He screamed once, high, panicked, and then choked because the smoke found his throat and tried to live there. Tem moved. She did not consider that the man had ridden with Crawley or that he likely laughed at her in town. She did not consider because there wasn't time. She jumped the trench the shovels had cut and landed in the smoke and caught the limb with the blanket still wet from the spring and rolled it. Fire bit through the wool and kissed her wrist again in a line that would write itself on her skin later. She kept rolling until the limb fell free. The boot came up with it. The ankle bent wrong and he went down. Tem grabbed his collar and hauled him 2 lengths into air that was less malignant than the air he'd been in. She saw the shape of his face under the ash, the boy who sold jerky from his uncle's canvas in town, who tipped his hat to women out of habit when he remembered, and out of parody when he forgot. "Go," Tem said to the boy behind him, who had run up with nothing in his hands but fear. "Take him, water first, then cold cloth. Keep him from looking at the foot until he's got breath. Eyes lie to men with pain." The boy nodded as if he had spoken his native tongue and he had been waiting to be given his real job. He hooked his hands under his friend's armpits and dragged him toward the spring with that dragging, loving competence boys use on each other when the world suddenly calls them men without training them for it. By then the worst of the fire had run its length. Oil is a hurry-up-and-be-something kind of substance. It made a show, and like all shows, it spent itself. The river ran on, carrying away smears of dark and tongues of red until the tongues got embarrassed by their own thinness and went out. Smoke lay low and then lifted, like a veil being reminded a face under it is not a secret. The riders did not whoop, they did not beat their chests. They did what men who have chosen their count do. They walked the lines they had made and looked for coals that would say later, "I was here first and deserve a second chance." They found them and ended the argument in a handful of dirt.
Tem went to the spring house and put her hand on the jamb where the lancer's palm had rested. The wood was warm, no more. She stepped inside. Tavier's eyes were awake and bright and furious in the way a boy's eyes get when the world keeps making noise and his body keeps asking him to hold still, and the two do not bow to each other. "Alive," she said, and meant the house and the riders and herself and the dogs and the horses and the river and the stupid wagon and the men she did not like much who had turned into water-bearers when the time came. Tavier's mouth moved around a word that would have been laughter if his ribs had had the room. He settled for the shape of it and the handshake with her eyes that said, "I saw what you did, even if no one else ever tells it right." She stepped out, and the night looked back like an animal with its hunger sated. Elijah leaned on his shovel and laughed once without sound, chest shaking with the release of a man who has kept himself together because someone had to. The lancer wiped his palm on his fringe not to clean it, but to tell it the work was done. A figure moved at the cottonwoods. For a breath, Tem thought Crowley had come to gloat at the wreckage he had ordered and had been cheated of. The shape resolved into a boy on a mule, hatless, cheeks shiny with tears cut into soot. He slid off the mule and ran the last 10 steps as if he had saved that run for this moment and this place. "Mrs. Hale," he gasped out, half wrong on her name and not caring. They set the north pasture, too. Wind's wrong. It's running for the Lashley barn. My ma said—" He gulped, eyes going past Tem to Elijah and the riders and then back to Tem like a compass needing a north. "She said you'd know what to do." Tem's mouth moved before her brain could ask how on earth she had earned a sentence like that. "Buckets and brooms," she said. "What gunny sacks and green boughs. Send whoever you can. We'll come." She turned to the lancer. "I can't ask." "You do not ask," he said. "We go." He did not even turn his head. His hand cut air and the ring shifted its shape as if the air had told it what it was now. Half a dozen men slid into their saddles like a shirt. Elijah threw his shovel into the wagon bed and climbed up like a boy late to summer chores. Tem ran for the bay, who lifted her head and snorted and set her feet for the thing she knew. More. They went. The night had already taken one shape and was taking another. They matched it, not with noise, but with the kind of haste that leaves room for each other to be wise. Where the river had been a sheet, the pasture was stitchwork. Narrow tongues of fire and clipped grass, small leaps in dry thatch, one longer line where a wind had found a path and made itself a canal. Tem remembered a summer 2 years ago when lightning had struck in 4 places at once, and the town had learned how to carry fire in blankets and throw dirt with the heel of a hand. She didn't remember who had taught them, but she remembered how it had been learned. In the dark, with breath pressed against teeth, with men listening to a woman because they were too tired not to. They put it out the way you put out an argument between neighbors, not by winning loudly, but by smothering it from 3 sides until it ran out of air. The barn shone in the shallow red, big and old and full of the smell of cattle and rope. Tem saw a girl in the darkness of the loft looking down with her hair loose and her mouth open as if the world had decided to sing at her, and she had forgotten all the words. "Down!" Tem called, and the girl moved, pale feet on the joists, nimble as a creature that remembered at the last possible moment that it was made to live. By the time the eastern sky had taken one thin step toward gray, the pasture burned only in 2 little lines that were more stubbornness than fuel. Elijah sat on the wagon bed and looked like a man who had worked himself back into his body after being outside it a while. The lancer stood with his lance butt planted and listened to the wind with his face. Tem took a breath and felt her lungs remember that air was not only for carrying words and smoke. "Home," she said, and no one needed to be told whose home or where. Dawn lifted them back into her yard with the same hand that had sent them out. The spring house sat with its little door open like a mouth breathing easy. The dogs got up and shook and made the particular low sound dogs make when the world had finally decided to be reasonable. The bay blew and nosed Tem's shoulder as if to say, "Again?" Tem put her forehead against the horses and rested there a heartbeat and let herself be an animal with another animal, and nothing else. The weight of hooves on the road came through the ground then, different than last night's, organized in that way that makes more noise than even numbers account for. Tem lifted her head. Elijah's eyes met hers. He looked toward the cottonwoods and then back to the spring house and then to the lancer. Nothing passed in words. Everything did.
Uniforms moved between the trees, blue and brass catching the early light. Rangers, Tem thought first. Then another flash, not Texan, U.S. Army. A small detachment, dozen, maybe 15, led by a captain who wore his hat like a man used to the weight of it on his mind. Behind him, 4 men she knew from the county, constable's deputy, 2 men with papers in their pockets, a third with a mouth like a button that had been sewed on too tight. Crowley rode just outside the right flank, not close enough to get dust on his boots, close enough to be seen as part of the procession he had wanted to summon. Tem swallowed the dryness in her mouth. She untied the white rag and lifted it to shoulder height. Not a wave, not a plea, not a surrender. A language. The lancer looked at the flag and then at her, and then at the men. He did not raise his lance. He lowered it to the crook of his arm, the way a man does in council. The captain drew up. He did not bark. He did not smile. "Morning," he said, and made of the word a test. "We heard 2 things at once in town. 1, there's a boy lying in your spring house who belongs to the people camped at your fence. 2, there was an attempt made last night to set light where it had no business being set. I'm here to sort which of those is a story and which is a fact." Elijah stepped forward. "Both," he said. "Both are facts. And there's a third. Some men made choices against parley. We've got eyes that saw and hands that'll swear it." Crowley's smile showed teeth. "You'll take a preacher's word over a storekeeper's?" "I'll take the truth over the cheapest thing in the market," the captain said without looking at him. "Miss Hale." He touched the brim of his hat a fraction. It was more respect than Crowley had given her in 2 years of town meetings. "Your house, your land. Speak." Tem felt the ground through her bare feet and took her count in that. "He bled here," she said. "I bound him. His father stood there." She nodded toward the place where the lancer now stood. "Men fired on a white rag. Men threw fire. We put it out. We returned the horses they say were taken. We've got your county brands in my rail if you want to count something with your hands." She lifted her burned palms without making a show of them. "And I caught a torch, Captain. With these, you can smell the pitch if you need proof."
The captain's gaze went to her hands and then to the wagon where the kerosene barrel lay on its side like a drunk. The mud around it was black with regret. He looked at Elijah's sleeve, tar-streaked. He looked at the trench cut across the yard. He looked at the wet hides slumped like sleeping beasts. "Let me see the boy," he said at last, "with his father. I won't step without his word." He lifted his hand toward the lancer and set it midway between them in the air. "Parley." The lancer's jaw worked once as if testing whether the word could be trusted coming from a man in blue. He nodded and turned. Tem led them down the slope. The spring house felt taller when a war was asked to stay outside it. Tavier watched the doorway with the patience of people who learn early that the world likes to make noise before it earns quiet. He saw the hat brim and the brass and did not flinch. He saw his father and breathed out. The captain took off his hat before he stepped under Tem's lintel and bent because the door asked him to. "Son," he said in the voice a good officer uses when he speaks to a private who is still young enough to go home whole, "did this woman stitch you?" Tavier looked at Tem and then made the little nod that passes between people who have been counting breaths together. He touched the silver disc lightly and then lifted his hand and set it on Tem's wrist and then on his father's. He said Tavachi with a quiet that was not meekness. The captain did not understand the word with his mind. He understood what it did to the air. He put his hat back on and stepped into the yard. He looked at Crowley. "You got witnesses to you lighting the river?" Crowley barked a laugh. "You see a river burning, don't you? You see horses in her yard. Put those together. Call it what it is." "I'll call it what it is when I've counted it all." He turned to Elijah. "You saw who rolled the barrel." "I saw 2 boys from the lower ford and a man whose mama called him Abel. I can name the boys. They're half ashamed and whole sorry." Crowley went very still. Tem recognized the stillness. She had seen it in a snake under a board when a hand reaches. "You calling me an arsonist?" he said softly. "I'm calling you what you did," Elijah said. His voice didn't get big, it got heavy. "You threw fire at a woman's house. The rest is adjectives."
The captain blew out through his nose. "I don't have the jail space to sort every man's soul," he said, "but I've got enough to hold one man overnight while I write to the judge." He nodded to the deputy. "Take Mr. Crowley into town. No cuffs. Don't insult him. Don't let him ride loose." Crowley exploded then, as if the button mouth on the man beside him had popped and all the pressure in the room had been living in Crowley the whole time. "You'll hang for this," he spat at Elijah, at Tem, at the lancer, at the captain, at the world. "Every one of you. You let that boy go and every calf between here and the Lianos gone by winter. Every girl with hair past her shoulders." "Abel," the captain said flat. He didn't raise his voice. Sometimes flat is enough. "I'm taking the ones you can't say into my pocket. They can holler there until the judge decides whether they get to be facts." Crowley looked at the men around him for a long second like a drowning man looks at the surface. Not one stepped into the water. The deputy put his hand on Crowley's bridle just above the bit and turned the horse. They rode away the way men ride when their whistles are empty. Silence did that thing it does where it makes a place bigger and smaller at once. The captain turned to Tem, then to the lancer. "I don't have orders for this," he said, and Tem felt a thread of realness take hold of the morning. "You've got your boy, and I've got a river that smelled oil and liked the taste. I'm going to write a letter that will satisfy some men and offend others. While it rides, I suggest you ride too." He touched his hat toward the spring house. "Give him a day for that stitch if you can spare it. Lady," he added, and Tem realized with a jolt that he had made the title mean what it should. "You've done the work of 10 men. Go eat." They rode out, blue and brass turning back into shadows in the trees. The riders in the ring did not relax because relaxing is for places with walls and locks and men who forget one morning does not end a story. The lancer came to stand at Tem's shoulder. He did not reach for thanks. He did not offer it. He looked at the white rag tied high and at the barrel laying on its side like a sin that had gotten tired, and he nodded once. That was accounting enough. The third day smelled like wet ash and coffee and something Tem decided to call stubborn hope. Tavier slept long and deep and woke with a hunger that made Tem believe in God as surely as any prayer had. She fed him salt pork cut fine and potatoes mashed in milk and saw irritation cross his face for the first time at the taste of needing help. It pleased her more than it should have. "Walk," he said, meaning stand. She lifted her hands and he slapped them away with a look so sharp she almost laughed. He got his feet under him and then stayed with them, grateful not for the standing but for being allowed to be the one doing it. He took one breath wide and his stitches pulled and he grimaced and the look said, "Later we will argue about the patience you are asking me to borrow." "Later," she said aloud, because she knew that argument the way she knew her own hands. He nodded once. He made a shape with his fingers, two curves that touched and parted and touched again. "Soon," she guessed, and he allowed the guest to stand. Men came and mended what had burned, the gallery post, a run of fence, the corner of the kitchen where heat had peeled paint like an onion. They did it without talking, like doing the work itself might keep the story quiet while it cooled. Elijah went to town and came back without Crowley in his shadow, and with a letter from the captain stuck in his hatband like a feather. It said nothing and everything. The boy belongs to his people. The law will take up with the man who threw fire. The army is going to be somewhere else this week on account it has to be everywhere at once and is no good at it. The Lancers stood by the gate in the afternoons and watched the road. And when Tem asked once whether he was waiting for trouble or for the wind to shift, he looked at her with a hint of mischief that made him younger and said, yes. He had a way of setting the truth and the joke on the same plate and letting a person choose which bite to take. The fifth morning, Tavier's fever did not come, and his wound did not seep, and the red around it went to a quieter pink. He sat and plaited 3 strands of horsehair he had asked for without words, and when Tem handed him a strip of rawhide to finish the ends, he nodded with the grave satisfaction men get from using their hands on something that will outlast pain. "Tomorrow," the Lancer said, "we ride." Tem knew that tomorrow was always out there with its hand held ready to collect. She had not known the shape of the hand until it moved. It was large and gentle and terrible. She cooked a pan of cornbread darker than she meant and a pot of beans better than she remembered knowing how to cook. She put a sliver of salt pork in Elijah's palm when he came at dusk, and he blessed it with his eyes and ate half and saved half without asking for a napkin, because it's a kind of sin to put manners between hungry and fed.
"No," Tem said quietly to the dusty left, "it never is." The riders moved then, not to chase him, not to make a mood, but to do the thing they had come to do. The Lancer lifted his chin toward Tem, his mouth made the smallest shape, a private blessing that used only air, not sound. Tavier pressed his palm to his chest and then toward her. She answered it. She wanted to gather him up the way a woman gathers a child who has pulled a foolishness and lived. She wanted to hand him the whole world in a cup. She put 2 fingers to her own lips instead and gave him the thing they had made together. "Thank you. I see you. Go." They turned. They rode. The ring lifted when it reached the road and then settled like a flock of birds making a new shape. The white rag flicked once in a breeze and hung still. The dogs lay down with their chins on the boards and looked toward the springhouse door and then toward Tem and then went to sleep because they trusted her to notice what needed noticing. Elijah stood until the last rider's braid disappeared behind the mesquite. He put his hand on Tem's shoulder and squeezed once and let go. "You could rest," he said, and smiled because they both knew she would not. "I could," she said, "but a room is easier to keep clean than to clean once it's gone bad." She turned to the trench and saw where it would need deepening before the next bad idea took up residence in a man's mouth. She went to fetch the shovel. She made 2 moves before the world made one of its own. A boy on a lathered pony came hard from the north, hair wild, shirt open, the look on his face that towns teach boys early when a thing is bigger than their voices.
He stumbled the pony to a stop and slid sideways, almost falling, and had to put his hand on the ground to make the earth count for him again. "Miss Hale," he panted. "Riders. Bluecoats. No, not them. Dust. Comancheros." The word came out like a stone kicked down a well. 3 miles. They've got a woman, Mrs. Norris, and a child, and they're headed for the cut. Crowley says to let 'em run. Says they ain't his trouble." He looked at her hands and then at the white rag on the rail. I didn't know who else. Tem didn't feel her feet at all this time. She found herself at the bay's side with a bridle in her fingers and calm in her chest that surprised her. Elijah was already reaching for his rein. The lance glinted once on the road bend far off where her riders had disappeared, one brief silver language spoken to a sky that did not need it and said it anyway. Tem swung up and found her voice where she had left it, inside her chest, wrapped around the count she had been keeping since the morning a boy bled on her stone. She turned to the boy on the pony and gave him the shape of the world as she planned to ride into it. "Find the preacher's bell, ring it until you can't hear yourself anymore, then come after us." She put 2 fingers to her own lips and sent a whistle high over the yard. The younger dog's ears pricked. He came and took up his spot at her stirrup like a soldier who had been promoted by virtue of not dying. Elijah's hand struck her boot again. "Go." The horizon breathed out a thin line of dust where men had made a thought and were riding it like a bad horse. The bay gathered herself. Tim lifted the white rag and tied it to her wrist, this time not her rail. The knot bit into the burned place and told her exactly who she was. They ran for the cut, where a river makes a narrow, and men make narrow ideas into hard times if nobody stands in the slot and says a different word. Now. When the last of the light went, the riders began to sing low. Not a war song. Not a thing Tem had words for. It moved across her yard like water moves through grass, making everything it touched bend the way it was always meant to bend. Tevea fell asleep with his palm over the silver disc and the braid of horsehair tucked under his wrist like a friendly snake. Tem stood in the doorway of the spring house and watched the dark lean against her fence with the easy confidence of a neighbor who knows when to stop at the gate and when to knock. The lancer came and stood beside her and said nothing. His quiet made a space where she could put the words that did not need air yet. "Do you have a name for me?" she asked finally, thinking of the way he had called her, not by the sound she had been given, but by the count she had kept. He considered, not lazily, but like a man hefts a tool to feel whether it fits his hand. He said a short shape in his language, then he said it again, slower, for her mouth. It sat on her tongue like a pebble from a clean creek. He said it once more, and then gave her the closest thing he had to a translation in a word that made Elijah's sermons and Crawley's lies both look like tin spoons next to it. "The one who stands inside fire and makes it forget its job," he said. Tem snorted, because snorting was the only way to carry something like that without falling down under it. "Shorten it," she said. "I've got chores." He cut the long name into a shorter shape with a flick of his hand. She repeated it and made it hers. Morning put light on everything that had tried to hide. The riders tightened girths. The lancer took the lance and set it once more against his shoulder. Tevea stood with his weight on both feet, the silver disc shining as if polished by all the hands that had held it these days. He had his father's mouth and Tem's stubbornness now, and something from himself that was not borrowed from anyone, a way of carrying pain that did not hand it off to the next person in line. They did not make a ceremony, because life does that for you without asking. Tem held the bay's rein in her left hand and the white rag in her right, and said nothing. The lancer stepped close enough to be counted as part of her body in case anyone was tallying, and set his palm to her shoulder. Then he took her burned hand in his scarred one and placed Tevea's smaller whole hand on top of theirs and closed his around both. "Tabaki," he said, And this time, the word did not mean the vow or the boy or the son. It meant all of it at once, the way a man means the river when he says water. She nodded. Tabaki, she said back, and it felt like putting a horse up after a long ride. Water and hands and hay, and then the quiet. They turned to go, not away from her, but toward what was theirs. The ring thickened as they moved, not to hide them, but to show anyone with eyes what matters is not permitted to ride alone if it can be helped. Tem stepped back so they could leave the yard, and then stepped forward again, because stepping back felt like a thing a person accidentally does when they mean to be generous and end up being small. A rider came up from the bend without noise. He wore a hat pulled low and a coat wrong for the weather, and a decision in his face that had the stiffness of a man who has been practicing alone for too long. Tem's heart put a hand on her ribs the way a mother puts a hand on a child's shoulder in a crowd so she can feel him. Elijah saw the man and came to stand on Tem's other side. The rider stopped 10 paces out and pushed the hat back. Crowley. She didn't understand until she saw how his jaw worked, that it was possible to wear shame and fury together. His eyes were little and bright and wild the way a fox's eyes are when it has been trapped and chewed and escaped and knows the trap is still there and might be in the next hole. For a breath, Tem let herself be sorry for the boy he had been who had learned to build a life out of lies because no one had given him better boards. He said, "Judge set me loose. Said there wasn't enough to prove nothing. Said a river will burn if a man looks at it hard enough." He smiled with only one side of his mouth. "I told you I'd be back." Elijah's body changed. Tem knew that change, the way a man loosens and tightens at once when the next sentence he speaks might be the one he's judged by if God is paying attention. The lancer did not move his feet. He let the lance stay on his shoulder like a thought he was not done with. "I'm going to fix what you broke," Crowley said to Tem. "You twisted men against me. You made friends with your enemies. You need reminding what side you're on. I'm on the side of the thing that kept your barn standing and let your boy drink out of my trough without asking." Crowley's hand twitched toward his coat. Tem saw the angle of the shoulder, knew what pocket the angle had been made to cover. She could have reached for the rifle behind the post. She did not. She lifted the white rag instead and held it up where he could see it, knuckles white. The rag was not a charm, it was not a magic, it was not a shield. It was a word the world had agreed on the day before and had to remember today. "Don't," she said. It was small. It was the only true thing. It held all of the other words behind it, like a door holds a room. Something in Crowley's face went slack. The door in him that had known the shape of mercy once and had been boarded shut by practice shifted on its hinges. The part of him that had choked at the sight of her holding a torch underwater moved. Maybe it was the ring around Tavea and his father, men silent and watchful. Maybe it was Elijah's hat tilted back like a man about to kneel. Maybe it was the line of buckets still full on her gallery, absurd in daylight, ready anyway. He did not draw. He spit in the dust and missed and turned his horse. "This isn't done," he called back, the lie riding with him like a burr under the saddle.